Hi folks, Carl James here from Electric Media Madness. I'm joined today by Andrew Johnson. How you doing, mate?
I'm all right. How are you?
Yeah, not too bad, thanks. I just want to apologise to our viewers and listeners before we start. If I sound a bit nasally and a bit croaky, that's because I've stuck with a bit of a bad cold today. So I apologise if that puts people off. But I'll soldier through this because I wanted to talk to you about something that I'd been looking into recently, and obviously because of the extensive research you've done into the moon landings, about the alleged moon landings, we shall say, and fakery and things like that over the years. I thought it would be really interesting to pick your brains on it. So before I get into that, really, I wanted to just briefly talk about Stanley Kubrick because it's something that just seems to crop up, it's cropped up for years. And for some reason, I'm not entirely sure why, but it seems to be cropping up again at the moment. I don't know if you know of any particular dates or anything that's going on at the moment that maybe have something to do with that. The only thing I can think of is it's coming up to, is it no, it's actually just gone actually 25 years since he died. So maybe
Right.
it's that. I don't know.
Could
So
be. I mean,
1999, wasn't it?
it might just be a symptom of a bit more skepticism in certain areas now of official narratives.
Yeah,
There's
yeah.
been an increase in that, and therefore there's a bit more skepticism of the moon landings.
Mm, mm.
And therefore, that's been linked to Kubrick, and we'll discuss that a bit more. We've talked about it quite a bit already, but
Yeah,
you've got
yeah.
some kind of newer research to talk about.
Yeah.
And I think there's been that film as well recently, the Fly Me to the Moon film.
Yeah, which I still haven't seen. You did tell me about that. Yeah. I don't
Yeah,
know if you want to tell our viewers and listeners just a little bit about it because I was fascinated by it.
yeah. Well, it's actually a romantic comedy, and
Mm.
the main character is one of the fictional controllers of one of the Apollo missions at NASA, and it actually starts off with a scene from Apollo 1.
Right,
Interestingly,
okay.
it is an interesting film. I mean, it's not like earth-shattering or anything, but I won't give any spoilers away, but it's certainly worth watching. And even if you just whatever your sort of thoughts on the moon landing, whether you just want to stick with the official narrative because it's too painful not to,
Mm,
or whether you're somebody like me who has no real doubt anymore
mm,
that it was faked. Whether whichever of those positions you're at, that film you'll probably get some enjoyment out of it.
mm, mm.
Whatever you're at on that. So I think that's quite a good sort of indication of how well the film is made. And I was surprised actually at some of the things that were in it because I didn't think I'd read from the synopsis it goes quite a lot further than in the film than I expected in terms of suggesting that it was hoaxed.
Mm.
They've done the producers have done a lot more work on that than I thought they would for a film like that. So it works quite well, and maybe it is a reflection of the increasing skepticism now. I mean, we saw it a little bit, didn't we, with the
Yeah,
Interstellar film,
yeah,
didn't
yeah,
we?
yeah,
But that's
absolutely.
like 10 years ago now.
That film, Fly Me to the Moon, was it called? Didn't you say that
Yes,
there was a Kubrick thing in there as well? Or
there
did
is
I
actually a
misremember?
Kubrick reference
Yeah,
in there.
yeah.
Yes, yes, there is, and maybe that's perhaps caused people to search for it a little bit as
Mm.
well. So yeah, the other thing which came to mind was that we this Jay Widener film that's been published, the Jay Widener and Ryder Lee film about The Shining. It's called
Yeah,
A
it's worth
Clockwork
talking about
Shining,
that. Yeah, yeah.
and we'll probably mention that a bit more later
Mm,
on.
mm.
Did you get a chance to watch that?
I have watched it, yes, yeah.
Okay, right. So you get the
Um,
gist of it.
yeah,
So
yeah.
yeah, so
We can
that
get into that,
that
yeah, yeah.
yeah, so that's sort of it's another Kubrick thing and then that's only just come out as well. So if it's anything, it's I think that came out last month or in
Yeah, yeah, it's been the last
September,
few,
October, I
yeah,
think.
yeah.
Yeah, and you can see that on Amazon Prime
Hmm.
if you've got Amazon Prime.
I obviously gave you a draft copy because I'm currently
Mm.
writing science fiction and Global Agenda Volume 3, and I was putting together a lot of this stuff based on a few things that have happened, which I will get into as we're going along. Recently, I've rewritten that draft quite substantially. It's actually ended up becoming three chapters now.
Oh right, okay.
One about the life and career of the chap that we will talk about in a minute,
Yep.
which is probably going to be given away by the title of this video. It's Douglas Trumbull. Another chapter where I've kind of revisited some stuff that I'd written about before to do with Stanley Kubrick, and then moved on to the moon related stuff with both Stanley Kubrick and Douglas Trumbull in the third chapter. And in doing that, I was actually reminded of something which I don't know if I've had a chance to speak to you about it yet, but I believe that well, I'm certain actually that this narrative of Douglas Trumbull being involved in moonfakery, which is the basic gist of what we're going to talk about, potentially being involved, I should say. It seems to just like the muddling that went on with Stanley Kubrick, which I've done talks about, as you know. I talked on, I think at least for about 10 years ago, I think it was now that I did
Yeah,
those talks and did an episode on Rich Planet, Richard D. Hall's Rich Planet
yeah.
TV about it as well. And I mentioned about this stage during the 1990s where there was like effectively a limited hangout to do with Stanley Kubrick. A lot of muddling that there was this article that was around, floating around the internet in the 1990s. I think it's been archived on the Clavius website even till now. I can pull it up in a minute and the quote from it. But it doesn't just mention Stanley Kubrick in that article, it also mentions Douglas Trumbull. So that's way back in the mid 1990s. That article is the one that really muddled up for whatever reason it was that they were doing it, because this is the article that they mentioned about Stanley Kubrick having a brother called Raoul, and he didn't have a brother called Raoul.
All right. Yes.
There's a lot of muddling in that. Let me just see if I can find the quote for it. So the article is Stanley Kubrick and the Moon Hoax. Pretty straightforward title to it. And you can find it on the Clavius website. But that's just where it's been sort of re-uploaded from the original places that it was during the 1990s. And the specific quote in that says, for 16 months, Stanley Kubrick and Douglas Trumbull worked in a specially built soundstage in Huntsville, Alabama, creating the first and second moon landings. Now, make of that what you will. I mean, I do think there's a lot of information in that article, which is like you've looked into with 9/11 as well. There's a limited hangout there, and I don't know the specific shape of it, but whether it is that um, Douglas Trumbull is the distraction away from Stanley Kubrick, or Stanley Kubrick is the distraction away from Douglas Trumbull, or whether neither were involved or both were involved. Basically, that's kind of
Mm,
where I am
mm,
with it at the moment.
mm.
Because as I've said before, I've never been I've never found any solid 100% evidence proof that Stanley Kubrick was involved. I'm completely open to the idea that he did, and he probably did. But this thing sometimes that irks me a little bit on the internet is people saying, we've got the proof now of X, Y, and Z. And it's built around a lot of circumstantial factors, very, very compelling circumstantial factors. I mean, it probably would be very, very difficult to find that proverbial smoking gun on that one. With how you would find that, I don't know. But I think one of the things that I wanted to do with this, um, and obviously being able to get this video up onto your platform as well, obviously reaches a larger audience. So my intent here is to put everything that I've found out there, and then hopefully somebody will build on that and find something that I haven't found, which will take us in a more solid direction. If does that make sense?
Oh yeah. Just for the record, really, I sort of have similar thoughts to you
Hmm.
in that I've never come across any evidence that Kubrick definitely was involved in the hoaxing. I think really he probably knew
I
about
do.
it, and
I do. I
he
think there's
may even have
evidence
known.
actually that he
Yeah,
did know about
right.
it. Yeah.
And I think he probably knew the people that did it if he wasn't involved
Yeah.
directly with
Yeah.
it.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And again, as you said a minute ago, maybe exactly the same could be said for Douglas Trumbull.
Hmm.
Because I mean, when you sent me your chapter and I read through it with great interest, I think, and I don't think you'd said otherwise to me really, but I couldn't see any direct evidence that
No.
Trumbull was involved in the hoaxing either.
No.
But there's
No.
certainly some circumstantial things which make him look like quite a strong suspect,
Hmm.
and that's perhaps as far as we can go with it.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think also that what you said about the article, sort of trying to direct people. Well, again, we saw that about would have been about 10, 12 years ago, I think,
With that
and I think
interview.
with that fake interview, that fake Kubrick
Yep.
interview with the actor called
Yep.
Tom, that was
Yep.
all that got in the Daily Mail and everything.
Yep.
So that was to me was a real indication that
I think that was very much a case of the limited hangout at work.
right. So
Yeah.
they were trying to sort of suck people into this false narrative again,
Yeah.
with Kubrick being
Yeah.
admitting that he'd done that, and
Yeah. Yeah.
it's just another story, really.
again, it's one of those things that I'm not really sure what the shape of that limited hangout
No,
is, really. I
me
mean,
neither.
we obviously we know with things like 9/11, we know what that's about, don't we?
Mm,
I mean, you've studied it
yes.
enough, you've written
Yeah.
books about it and all that and whatnot.
Yeah.
But I don't know exactly what the intent is behind this. It may be that none of those people are involved, this, and it's just to divert attention away from that, just
Yeah.
pinning a name on it. I really don't know, but
Mm. I think one thing that is really interesting in relation to directly to the hoaxing and where it was done. I mean, if you read Bart Sabrell's book, which came out a couple of years ago, Moon Man,
yeah,
he has a statement in that fairly clear cut statement that it was filmed at Cannon Air Force Base,
yes, yeah, yeah,
and
yeah,
he was told this by a military police officer that was dying, and he told that to his son, and I think his son has since either died or passed on, and he made a video about it, sort of confirming that what he told Sabrell about
mm,
it being filmed. His dad had told him it was filmed at Canon AFB, and he
yeah,
had a
yeah,
list of
yeah,
people, including Lyndon B. Johnson was allowed to go in, Buzz Aldrin, Neil Armstrong, they were allowed to go in,
yeah, yeah,
and
yeah,
I think there were about 8 or 9 other people on this list.
yeah, yeah.
And that was very, very interesting. And
Mm.
again, Sabrell's been at this for a long time. It's not like this information
Yeah,
came
yeah,
from it came from some newcomer, as we sometimes find, that comes on the
yeah,
scene like with
yeah,
this earth-shattering information. No, Sabrell came out with this 2 or 3 years ago now, maybe four
yeah,
years ago
yeah,
by now.
yeah,
So I think that's a fairly good indication that it wasn't filmed at Area 51, and it
no,
wasn't filmed at Pinewood or
yeah,
any of
yeah,
these
yeah,
other places
yeah.
that are alleged to have. Nobody had heard of Cannon AFB as being the possible
Hmm.
uh, filming location. So I think that
Mm.
that perhaps is not a bad bit
Yeah,
of
yeah, yeah.
information we got through Sabrell there.
I think another one of the slightly, I would imagine it probably is a limited hangout again, potentially, is I've heard this floating around a lot recently, again, is the idea of it being filmed at Lookout Mountain Film Studios.
Ah,
Um, but I'm not convinced of that. I mean,
mm,
I've looked into it a fair bit myself, but again, recently I found this article from 2020. I'm just going to see if I can read a little bit of it from you. Apollo Investigation, Stanley Kubrick and Apollo Part 2, Significant Clues Encoded in the Films of Stanley Kubrick. And this is written by Mary Bennett and David
oh
S.
yes.
Percy. So
Oh, okay.
it's on their Owlis website, Owlis Online, you know.
What's the date on that article, Carl? I'll have
So
to go
this
and
was
read that.
2020, but I think
Oh,
it was
fairly
updated
recent.
in about 2022, so it's fairly
I
recent.
don't think I've read that. Oh, I'll have
Right,
to go and read
okay.
that.
I
Yeah,
will
yeah,
send you
yeah.
the link to it. Yeah, yeah.
Mm,
But I picked out a few little bits and pieces from it.
mm,
So the two things that I took away from it was they're not convinced at all that Laurel Canyon was involved. So they said one candidate, top secret US government production studio and post facilities, those look at mountain laboratories in Laurel Canyon, couldn't provide the height and studio size required for an enterprise. So I mean, I've looked at the measurements of what it, how big it was when it was functioning, because I think it stopped functioning effectively in about 1969. Officially, anyway, that's what I've been told. But there is an interesting story about this American Indian actor who brought the facility afterwards, turned it into a private resident, and he claimed that he'd found some like a moon set there or something like that. But
huh?
there's this chap who's researched some of the stuff that went on at Laurel Canyon, and he said it was more likely that they were faking some stuff to do with the Vietnam War there, and it was like sort of the type of terrain. Not that I'm sort of going with that, but there's a lot of things that have kind of sort of contradicted that. So that was interesting. But the other thing that Mary Bennett and David Percy said as well, they said Vivian Kubrick has defended her father in this regard, and in 2016 stated my father conspired with the US government to fake the moon landings is manifestly a grotesque lie. Now, make of that what you will, what Vivian Kubrick. I've got some questions about Vivian Kubrick and some of the things she's been involved with over the years, like organization that Tom Cruise is involved with, shall we say?
Oh,
I
really?
know
Yes.
YouTube doesn't like that word, and they say this is a sentiment which we wholeheartedly concur. For a man of Kubrick's character, there would have been no conspiring voluntarily. It would have been something he absolutely could not avoid. and the only option for keeping himself and his loved ones safe would mean that not speaking about this top secret job to anyone at all. So basically, they're not convinced that, and they do go into it, but quite a bit more if you read the
Mm.
article, but they're not convinced that Stanley Kubrick was involved, and they've basically said something along the lines of what I said, which is, I mean, they're much more flat on the line. No, he wasn't involved. I'm open to it. If he was involved, he wouldn't have talked about it, and so it would be very hard to find evidence. So what you would find, and I think they do say this in the article as well, would be like the allusions to it in his films and things like that, if nothing else. You could take this as a case of she said, he said. It's just, there's no way to confirm any of this or not. So my Disney contact went to this party and met a number of people there. Most of them worked in production behind the scenes, visual effects and that for decades, some of them. And my contact and this one person that they were talking to do have some mutual connections, so they were already somewhat acquainted. And so basically, as I come to understand it, there's some of these strange conversations that crop up at these kinds of things. That's the way I had it described to me. It's not all business. They do talk about bizarre things sometimes in the industry and things like that. Some of them, as my contact called it, conspiratorial. The subject of Stanley Kubrick came up, and my contact told this person about some of the research that I've done, including what I'd covered regarding Stanley Kubrick, Apollo, and all that kind of thing. And that FX person told my contact, I'm going to quote it here, they said, it's common knowledge that Trumbull was involved with the NASA Apollo cover up stuff, Douglas Trumbull, I should say. How much of it, though, is anybody's guess. So I was eager to learn more, and I tried to see if I could arrange to speak to this person through my contact. And a few months went by, it didn't really pan out. And then very recently, I was telling you as well that a similar thing happened again. My contact spoke to somebody else about it. And this person was much more up on my research and a lot of other research that other people have done as well. And it did look like I was actually going to get to speak to this person at the time. But then this person said, um, that so let me see how I'd put it here basically because I want to word it right, make sure the person did not agree with my take on 9/11, specifically my support and agreement of Dr. Judy Wood's evidence on directed free energy technology being used on 9/11. But it seemed that their position, they were just stuck in it and that was it,
Mm.
and they'd got no time to entertain people who disagreed on it or anything like that. So they'd got their position and I'd got mine and that was it, and it didn't seem as good. So I kind of came to a dead end as well, that one did. And you did talk to me about the possibility of maybe there might be a bit of muddling going on there through my contact, maybe. I mean, you can never be 100% sure with people. I do, I'm about as close to 100% as I can be with my contact. It doesn't feel to me like something that has been, I genuinely believe that this person said that to my,
Yeah, yeah.
but it does seem a very, very strange state of affairs, doesn't it?
It seems to be a line which there's even though people are seemingly open to, that particular one is a no-go area for so many people.
Yeah, 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 yeah,
Seen this time and
yeah.
again, it's quite eerie actually sometimes
Mm,
with some
mm,
people.
yeah. That's
Mm,
where I'd gotten with that.
mm,
And then obviously I'd said about the fact that I'd found that, remembered that article on Clavius and thought, well, is it possible that these people are just into this stuff and they've read it on the internet? If that article that mentions both Stanley Kubrick and Douglas Trumbull, which has been around for, nearly 30 years, I would say, at least, is it possible they came across that and they don't know anything? They've just regurgitating what they've read online. It seemed to me like they had some more personal contact with somebody that had said something. I don't know. I mean, again, it's one of those things that I'll potentially am never going to get any closer to finding out. So I hope I do, but
mm,
that was the whole point in doing this, so that maybe
mm,
somebody
mm.
will be able to bring something to the table that we don't know or haven't considered. So yeah,
We don't have access to classified information in our work or professional lives,
yeah,
and
yeah,
so, and then anyone that contacts us with those claims, we obviously treat skeptically. I mean,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
I've had this chap contact me quite recently about him being as, and I'm going to do a posting about this. He is meant to be a member of this international security agency, which he says is in charge of all the others, and
Right.
I'm not quite sure what to make of his statements.
Mm,
He could be totally honest, and he seems to have certain information, that does seem to have been classified, but
mm.
because it is classified, you can't really
That's it.
corroborate it with any other
Yeah,
sources because it's
yeah.
classified.
That's it exactly. Yeah,
It's
yeah.
very difficult when you get into these areas, and of
Mm,
course, some people will contact you and think that oh, we'll bait him with this information, and he'll put
yeah.
it on his YouTube, and that everyone will think he's brilliant for getting this information, and actually it turns out that it's a load of
Mm,
hogwash, and so you've got to be very wary of those sorts of approaches,
yeah,
and remain skeptical
yeah.
in your pursuit of truth. That I suppose is ultimately what
Mm,
what what
mm.
we're both sort of trying to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. I think again, it comes back to that thing that I was saying before, and I know it irks people. I know that I do tend to be very stubborn on that thing of evidence wherever possible. It's in, you can theorize, you can speculate. There's things that you can talk about in terms of lots of circumstantial evidence around it, but it does annoy me sometimes when people will say, "This is the smoking gun of this. This is the
Mm,
proof that X, Y, and Z." And I'm like, okay, show me the proof. I want to see it. And then they'll start. In the case of Kubrick, that happens a lot. But they'll
yeah,
start showing you
yeah.
things from images from the film in the background and things like that. And I was thinking, yeah, that's really interesting, and it could well be an indication of that. But that's not the proof of the thing that you're um, saying sometimes. I mean, one of the things that happens a lot that I hear, and I must make a point of saying this is not in any way, shape, or form to be critical of Jay Widener and Ryder Lee with Clockwork Shining or anything like that, because I have a huge amount of respect for what they've done, particularly Jay Widener's research, because he did so much in the Kubrick's Odyssey films
Mm.
before, and all that kind of stuff, and all the other researchers and the people that are involved in the documentary as well. Um, but there is that thing sometimes of like take for example they do say and in interviews as well that Kubrick worked for the government and say it as if it's a fact. I don't know. The only thing I've been able to find for definite was the two things that they do actually cite that in the documentary was this document where he was courted. It was classified for a number of years. He was courted to be part of this Festival of the Arts, White House Festival of the Arts, but there's never been any documentation to show that he actually was involved in it. And very early on and this is something new that I've discovered recently. I'm sure it's been out there for years and many people already know about it, but it's new to me anyway. That when he was about 22 or 23 years old, Stanley Kubrick, he made a film. Let me see if I can find the name of it. Yeah, it's called World Assembly of Youth. And this film was made for the US State Department. He was involved with the making of the film. It was like a kind of documentary thing, and you might find it interesting. Actually, I'll see if I can find the links for it.
Mm.
In that. It's all about this congress of diplomats that come from various countries all over the abroad to discuss things to do with the United Nations and the Universal Bill of Rights that was set up by Eleanor Roosevelt and all that kind of thing. So it's fascinating that Stanley Kubrick was involved with that. That's the only thing really that I've found in that respect. You could argue that the amount of people that he credits in that were originally in the end credits, I should say, of 2001: A Space Odyssey. We know these people were involved in the making of the film anyway. NASA, Bell Labs, and you name it, IBM, all that kind of thing. So he was working with them, but does that mean he was working for the government? That's the thing, isn't it? That's the question.
Yeah,
And it's
yeah.
very similar to what's happened, what I've found out about Douglas Trumbull as well. Because if anything, I've actually found quite a lot more that connects Douglas Trumbull to the powers that be, as it were, than Stanley Kubrick, which is why I was more interested in, that idea. I mean, the first one, really, I'm not going to list them all out here, but I would recommend people go and visit this website called famouskin.com. And the page is Ancestry of Douglas Trumbull. It may not mean anything, but when I was looking through his sort of genealogy and the people he was related to, it was staggering. So I found
Mm.
British kings and queens, European royalty, US presidents, signees of the US Declaration of Independence, UK prime ministers such as Winston Churchill, actors, authors, poets, singers, scientists, explorers, inventors, NASA, and JPL people as well, including Alan Shepard, Buzz Aldrin, Robert H. Goddard, Werner von Braun. Then you've got people like Bill Gates, J.P. Morgan, Aldous Huxley, Alan Turing, Charles Darwin, Walt Disney, Alan Dulles, who was CIA,
Mm,
Margaret Mead, Willard Rockwell, who was the founder of Rockwell. This one's interesting as well. I'm sure you'll remember it, but David Angel, who was listed as he was the chap who created Frasier and was involved with Cheers. He was listed as being one of the passengers on Flight 11. So on 9/11, and then you've got numerous members of the Rockefeller family as well. So I mean that immediately for me was like the. I mean, you could argue that that's true of a lot of people in Hollywood. If you got, I mean, it's people like Britney Spears, for example. I mean, the amount of relatives that are very similar to that, So you could
really?
find a lot of celebrities and
Yeah.
do the same thing. So it may not mean anything, but it was interesting for me. Um, and then I found like that his first major job after he left college, he'd been doing these drawings of aerospace and space
That's right.
transportation and things like that. Yeah. He worked for this company called Graphic Film, and they were making short films for the US Air Force and NASA. Um, three specifically. One of them, To the Moon and Beyond, which was exhibited at the 1964 New York World's Fair. And that was the film that caught Stanley Kubrick's eye and brought him and Con Peterson, who was working at Graphic Films at the time as well, onto 2001: A Space Odyssey. So you've got their work with NASA, the US Air Force, and that you've got that, which kind of jives with the kind of stuff that was going on with the production of 2001: A Space Odyssey as well. The film Silent Running, which is
Mm,
a great film. Despite what I've written about it, I do maintain that it's a great film. That had support from the US Navy. They were allowed to film on a decommissioned ship. It was a Korean War aircraft carrier, USS Valley Forge, which the ship in the film was named after that as well. He worked with Dow Chemical to create all the plastic molding for the containers that were in the ship in Silent Runnings. That was another interesting thing that I'd found. Uh, I'm not going to get into it here, but huge amount of connections to Laurel Canyon. I mean, that could be true of most of the actors anyway,
yeah.
but the high strangeness surrounding the death of Natalie Wood in the film Brainstorm, and as you've pointed out to me in the past as well, the subject matter of Brainstorm. I mean, you're researching energy and consciousness at the moment for another book. I mean, that's literally that stuff, isn't it?
Yeah, a lot of it is
Brainstorm.
there, yeah.
Mm.
And I mean, the fact that Trumbull was so desperate to make that film,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
I mean, one of the things that I picked up from your chapter that you sent me was how difficult it was to finish that film.
yeah,
And
yeah, yeah.
yeah, I think the which movie company was it that was going to
I think it was MGM, if I remember
MGM? Yeah,
rightly.
because
Yeah,
they sort of pulled the funding or some of the funding, and it had to be finished with a bank loan or something, or
yeah.
some
There was,
investors or something, wasn't it?
yeah. Lloyd's of London was one of them.
That
Yeah,
was
there
it.
was,
Yeah.
yeah. It was an
So the whole
insurance
circum,
payout of some sort.
yeah,
Very,
yeah.
very peculiar. Very
It's all
peculiar.
very strange in terms
Yeah,
of the way that things normally work in the movie business, the film
yeah,
business.
yeah. I mean, it does
Uh,
happen. You do have insurance
yeah,
write-offs and things like that, and they
yeah,
they did
yeah.
try to write the film off and never release it. But yeah,
And then there was, the whole thing with the ending that was changed and stuff, wasn't it? From what?
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And I think what was the original story? I think the guy that wrote that he didn't like it, did he, or something, or he didn't like the ending.
There was some suspicion that the writer, the original writer of it, was on the CIA's payroll as well. That was another
Right,
thing that was interesting.
right.
There's a number of claims of that. I actually found an article in the old science fiction magazine Starlog that talked about that as well. There's actually a quote in there. I think it was the Chinese government at the time that accused him of being maybe Chinese or Nepalese government. Oh, I can't remember. I'm scanning through my notes here to try and
Mm,
find it.
mm. But
Let me
there's
just
a
see if I
whole
can find it.
there's a whole set of peculiar stories surrounding that film. Again that you elucidated in your chapter there, and
Yeah.
it also reminded me of how it was reminiscent to me of Operation Stargate, where the remote
Mm.
viewing stuff,
Yep.
where and
Yep.
there was a lot of psychic research going on in relation to that as well, and other things have come out since.
Yep.
Um, and I'm trying to think of the name of this document that I've mentioned in my book, in the Consciousness book, which is the CIA document. It's called,
Is it not the Gateway? Is it?
yeah, that's the
Yeah,
one, the
Gateway
Gateway
document. Yeah,
Process.
it's
Yeah, the Gateway
fascinating. That is. Yeah.
Process.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you can imagine that somebody like Trumbull, if he had contacts in the government,
Yeah.
he was somewhat aware of projects like that were going on.
Yeah.
Because I think that Gateway document was like 84, 85 or something, wasn't it?
Which was when
Or 82.
Brainstorm was made, and
Yeah,
85
well,
was
it came
released.
out in 83, Brainstorm, I think, didn't
Was it
it? Or
83? I thought
I
it was
think it was
85, but
because,
yeah, yeah.
no, I think it was because I was
Okay.
at Lancaster then at
Okay.
university and I watched it there. I saw it at university, so it must have come out before. I think it would have come out in 83 or 84 in the
Right.
UK.
Okay.
I'm almost certain of that.
It
It
was,
may have been
sorry, just to
85.
mention that name before I lose it again. It was Bruce Joel Rubin was the name of
Right.
the chap that wrote the original story for it. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, go on.
But yeah, so when I, rewatched the film, it was a while ago since I watched it now, maybe about 6 months or 8 months, because we've been looking to do this talk for a while.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um, and when I watched the film, it did make me think of the Gateway
Yeah.
Process
I
document, very
thought
much
exactly the
so.
same thing. Yeah,
So,
yeah.
so going back a little bit, so maybe Trumbull became aware of that in the late mid 70s, late 70s. He got a contact that had told him bits and bobs, and that was what made him interested enough to
Yeah,
get that he wanted to get that film made.
yeah.
I mean, again, we could also go into the whole occultism. One of
Hmm.
the things you sort of pointed out about the Silent Running film was the Saturn
The
connections,
sun,
and
yeah, it's all over it.
and
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, and all that sort of thing.
Not just in terms of the location where they go to, but the shapes, the geodesic domes, and the
Right?
containers in the ship, and the fact that it was originally based on the footage that was going to be shot for 2001: A Space Odyssey, which, as I've documented, that there were insiders who said, "Don't make it on about Saturn, make it about Jupiter instead." What
Yeah,
that's about, I don't know.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, of course, we can speculate again, but
Mm.
um, so that whole area of occultism is interesting, and one it's clearly something that Kubrick had some sort of knowledge of, and maybe
Yeah.
Kubrick and Trumbull did share those interests or shared knowledge, or they were, maybe Trumbull was an occultist. Who knows?
Don't know. Yeah.
I don't know if Kubrick was. I mean, I don't think he was, but I think he was trying to expose a lot of that, wasn't he?
Yeah, I know he researched a lot of that stuff, particularly to do with Eyes Wide Shut. He was looking into like ritual sex magic and things like that.
Yeah, yeah,
And he read a huge amount of books. That's all been documented. Actually, there's a video, I can't remember it off the top of my head, but it was Rob Ager, Collative Learning. He found that. He found all the research that Kubrick had done. And he had looked into all that sort of stuff to do with
right.
consciousness and things like that. So occult stuff, yeah, yeah.
So
Very well
maybe
researched.
maybe that's
Mm.
one of the th themes which both Trumbull and Kubrick sort of gelled on,
Mm.
and this maybe in making 2001, it was Trumbull thought, well, maybe I need to go in my own way and expose some of this stuff in a film as well. Maybe he
Mm.
wanted to do it because I mean, there's a lot of kind of weird stuff in that Brainstorm film, and it
Oh yeah,
was
yeah. I mean, I'm not going to read them out here because there's loads. I
no,
will get round to later, but you read through all those old Starlog magazines because
right,
I don't know if I know there's been some issues with the Internet Archive online lately. I don't know whether it's still working properly or not. I know somebody hacked it, didn't they? Allegedly hacked it, I should say. I think they're just trying to get rid of the past, basically. That's my personal take on that one. But all of the old Starlogs were on there. I know, free to download PDFs. So I downloaded the lot and I've pretty much read them all, which is like hundreds of issues, going back
mm,
30
mm,
odd years or more, looking for little clues of things. And I found some fascinating things. I've
mm,
sent you some bits and pieces
yeah,
as well, bizarre things that almost foreshadow stuff.
mm,
And you read through all these long interviews with Douglas Trumbull talking about the esoteric stuff and where Brainstorm was shot and all the companies that were involved with it and he's going down this real rabbit hole of consciousness and Yeah, it really does blow the mind. It's just, and there's actually I've got one little tiny quote here that I'll um pull up. It's so he says this was in 1997 actually. He says, I visited a scientist who had a helmet with magnetic fields controlled by computer sequences that could profoundly affect your mood and your perceptions. There's some work out there that's going into some really amazing territory. And I was thinking, you're bigging it up, but that's mind control type stuff. That is effectively.
It can be. It sounds to
It
me
can
like
be.
it sounds to me like he's referring to the work of Dr. Michael Persinger.
Hmm.
That's what it sounds like, although he
Yeah,
doesn't
yeah.
name him.
No,
So
no, he
that's the
doesn't
sort of
know.
thing he was doing,
Yeah.
something very similar to that. But I mean, we should really say a bit more about Trumbull, in terms of he was one of the main special effects guys on 2001. For
Yeah.
people not already familiar with that,
Yeah.
and then he went on to work on, as we say, Silent Running,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
and he got involved in Close Encounters of the Third Kind.
Yeah, I've got some interesting bits and pieces on that as well. When we come to in a minute. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, he was involved with Star Trek: The Motion
Motion
Picture,
picture. Yeah. Yeah.
which
Yeah.
I'd forgotten actually because and I think the chapter you sent, you were pointing out that a company
Yeah.
was hired to do the special effects for the
That's
Star Trek: The
right.
Motion Picture, weren't they? And then they just
Able
completely messed it
Associates, I
up.
think they were called.
Able
Yeah.
Associates,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
the Trumbull did it all in about 6 months, didn't
Yeah.
he?
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's
Very
interesting
close to
to
release date, but he got there.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and it's interesting to compare some of the effects that you see in that film with what's in Brainstorm as well, because
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
can see he's really got his stamp on those
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
amazing optical effects.
For me, that had an added layer as well because of all the research I've done into Star Trek: The Motion Picture to do
Mm,
with Lab 9, and I very much believe that film uh, was an outgrowth of Gene Roddenberry hanging around with all those people.
yeah, yeah,
So it's interesting that he was doing the special effects for that film, which
yeah,
is highly esoteric as well. So
yeah.
yeah, just thought I'd mention that while it came across my mind. Yeah,
Yeah, I mean that whole thing about the ending with Vija being a
yeah,
machine
yeah,
and
transhumanism and all that,
yeah,
and
transhumanism,
yeah,
that's all in there as well, isn't
yeah.
it?
And he
And
worked on Blade Runner as well, which is another treatise on
yes, I'd forgotten
transhumanism as
actually.
well.
Yeah.
Did the special effects for that. Yeah.
So all the sort of topics that you've written about, I mean, I've written them out a little bit in some places, and he's right in there, isn't he? And he's
Yeah,
right in the
yeah,
middle of
yeah,
those, really.
yeah,
So
yeah.
that's kind of interesting when you think about it.
Just briefly before we move away from Brainstorm, was what he actually said about it. I mean, obviously you've got the death of Natalie Wood, and that's strange in and of
Mm,
itself. I'm not going to go into that here because that's a huge subject. But he said in 2014 about working on that film, I was afraid for my life. My lawyer said, don't get on any airplane that's been booked by MGM. So I said, whoa, this is Hollywood. This is the movie industry. This is what I love. That is when I decided I'm not going to direct anymore. This is just too hard. I came back to the Berkshires a few months after we finally did get it finished, and I was almost PTSD, sorry. I was completely freaked out. It took me several years of therapy and whatever to kind of get myself back together. What's that all about? I mean, what went on with that film?
mm,
It's not just Natalie Wood. It's not just what happened
mm.
with her.
Makes you wonder if there's some argument about that film releasing too much kind of
I think so.
information.
Yeah, yeah.
Maybe it was something to do with that. But again, we can only speculate, can't we?
That's
It's,
right. Absolutely. Yeah, yeah.
the fact that he worked on models of the moon, didn't he, Trumbull?
Yes,
I
yeah,
don't know if you were
yeah.
going to
We
get
can
onto
definitely,
that
yeah, definitely, yeah, 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 yeah,
for the 2001 film. There's
yeah,
a few little bits there. Maybe you want
yeah,
to put that in as well.
yeah, yeah. I'll definitely talk about that in a minute. I just
Mm.
wanted to brief
Well
because
then,
it kind of all ties together for me in terms of my argument with him is he wasn't averse to secrecy. He wasn't averse
yeah,
to sort of muddling things and things like
yeah,
that. And if you look at his interest in ufology, that's fascinating. He did some special effects insert work for this thing called UFO Incident. I've not been able to find anything out about it really, but that was um, I think that was probably in the 80s,
yeah,
late 70s, early 80s, something like that. And then obviously he goes on to work on Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and he was why Spielberg wanted him on that film was because of his expertise in front screen projection, which is obviously one of the treaties on Stanley Kubrick with 2001 and the moon fakery type stuff. So he's doing all these incredible UFO scenes at Devil's Tower in the film. I do love Close Encounters of the film,
Mm,
Close Encounters of the Kind, whatever people might say about it. As a piece of cinema, it's a fantastic film. But
mm.
I do think there's muddling going on there. I think there's a
Yeah, definitely.
definitely. So he said of the film, I think because there was a weird kind of advertising campaign around Close Encounter Third Kind, where I don't know if you remember it, but
Oh, I do. Yeah.
yeah, the first encounter is this, the second encounter, laying it out. A lot of
Yep.
it based on like Jacques Vallée stuff and all that as well, wasn't it? Because they obviously had him as an advisor on the film.
Mm.
Um, but they never really said a great deal about
Well,
it.
Jacques Vallée was in the film,
I mean, he's in the
wasn't
film.
he?
That's right. Yeah, he was.
In
Yeah,
in
yeah,
in a, in a
yeah,
sense, yes.
yeah,
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 played
yeah.
by Francois Truffaut,
Well,
Lacombe.
yeah, I think
He was
Francois
called
Truffaut,
Lacombe in the film, but
his
it was
character
meant
was
to be.
based
Yeah,
on Jacques
yeah, correct.
Vallée.
That's what I mean. Yeah.
But yeah, you're right. Jacques Vallée was actually a cameo in it. He was in the background of
Oh, it was in the
the scene
background,
with
was it?
the
I didn't
big
see
ship,
that.
with the ship's going
Ah, okay.
do 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 do.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So and so he said about this that I think secrecy is a good policy. So he's saying it
Mm.
there. If we keep a low profile, no one will be disappointed when they see the movie. And then he kind of muddled it a bit, and he said Close Encounters wasn't secret for the purpose of trying to confuse people or create mystery. It was to avoid gross misconception about the film. Now, I don't, what he was trying to say about that as well. I don't know. Um, and recently, in watching some of the stuff about A Clockwork Shining, that we've obviously both watched that, and we're looking into some of that kind of stuff. I noticed that one of the chaps in that were Walter Bosley. He did some great stuff, and he was talking about Close Encounter of the Third Kind actually in an interview with Ryder Lee. And so he said back in 1981 or 82, Keith Shardle, Paul's son. Now I had to look into who this Paul Shardle was.
Oh,
Apparently,
yeah, yeah, yeah. I know who he
related to
is. Yeah,
ufology, all that
yeah,
kind of
oh,
stuff.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
So I
Um,
mean, I can
yeah,
cut
if
in
you
there
can tell me a bit about that, yeah, because I'm
because
not very
Paul
familiar.
Shartle was something like media officer for the Air Force, and he worked, or maybe he didn't work at Holloman an Air Force base, but he he knew, or he had information about the film that involves objects,
Right, okay.
UFOs, and he basically said that it was nothing to do with any filmmaking that the Air Force had done because he was in charge of the accounts for all of that, and he would have
Right.
known what had been produced.
Okay.
And he appears in the UFO cover-up exposed live from 1988, which was on YouTube. I've written about that in my acknowledged book.
Yeah,
Paul
yeah, yeah.
Shartle is the name. So he has knowledge of this Holloman film, and so why that's relevant to what we're talking about now. Holloman Air Force Base is Air Force Base in the US. It is alleged that the ending sequence of Close Encounters of the Third Kind, where the craft come in and have
Yeah.
that dialogue, that musical dialogue,
Yeah.
etc., that is meant to have been based on what happened at Holloman Air Force Base,
Right.
either in 54 or around that time, 1954,
Yeah.
that time.
Yeah.
Because remember, Close Encounters was 1977, so we're talking like 20 years before,
Mm,
20
mm.
odd years before that. And
Yeah.
it was Paul Shartle, I think, had some knowledge either of that incident or a similar one,
Right. Okay.
which is where Eisenhower was alleged to have met with aliens.
Right.
And it sounds crazy maybe to some of the people that are watching this, but please do read my book, Acknowledged.
Acknowledge. Yeah. I've
And I
just
go
recently
through,
read it. It's yeah. It's a great book.
thank you. And I go through, the sort of some of the stories related to that, and how I thought that was all bogus at first when I first came across that story. It was nonsense that Eisenhower would have met aliens, But having looked at some of the testimony, I'm much more convinced that something like that really did happen.
Mm.
And again, to expand on that a tiny bit, if you, there's somebody called Laura Eisenhower
Yeah.
who is on
Yeah.
Facebook, and she is I think the great granddaughter of Ike Eisenhower,
That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
and I've listened to her quite a bit, and she actually seems like a real person. She actually like posts things of her going hiking in the mountains, and she posts her frustrations with the world and stuff like that. And she just seems like a real person, and yet she tells these fantastic stories about, her father having knowledge of meeting the aliens and stuff like that. Well,
Yeah,
at least she talks in fairly, you know, so she talks a little bit about that anyway, and so that makes me kind of less skeptical than I was about it. I wouldn't say I'm 100% convinced that it
hmm
happened, but
yeah,
I think there's a lot of circumstantial evidence
yeah,
that
yeah,
it really did happen.
mm,
And I think that probably connects into this Trumbull story with the Close Encounters
yeah,
and
yeah,
Spielberg and the E.T. film,
yeah,
the extraterrestrial film. That's in the Acknowledged book as well.
yeah, 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 yeah.
And just to expand on that point, just before we go back to this one,
Mm.
I think the key one to talk about there is when Spielberg made the E.T. the extraterrestrial film.
Absolutely, yeah. I covered that in my earlier books as well. Yeah, which is
Yeah,
based
and
on like Grant Cameron stuff and things like that as well. The material that he got and things like that. So
some of
yeah,
it, but the extraterrestrial story was Bill Cooper told this story
that's right. Yeah, he did. Yeah,
in I think 1984, 85, that President Reagan had no, was it him? No, he said that the film. Sorry, Bill Cooper said that the ET film was based on the story of an Air Force officer encountering an alien and having to look after him for a year.
yeah,
And then in 2011, Spielberg actually confirmed that Reagan had said to him at the White House, "There aren't six people in this room who know
yeah,
how much
yeah,
truth there is in this film."
yeah, yeah.
And Spielberg, told this story. So,
Mm,
in other words, there was corroboration between what Spielberg was saying and what Bill Cooper was saying.
mm,
20 years earlier, 30 years earlier, sort of
yeah,
thing. So
yeah.
um, again, that's in my book if you want to
Mm,
study that and
hmm
look
Absolutely, yeah.
at the sort of links there.
Going back to what Walter Bosley was saying, so he said that Keith Shartle is Paul's son, that he went to work for a company called DreamQuest, and DreamQuest was started by some guys who got their start from Douglas Trumbull on Close Encounters of the Third Kind. There's been a legend going around because I heard about this 40 years ago that the accountant had told the guys that founded DreamQuest that government money went into Close Encounters of the Third Kind, okay? And later when I learned who's Keith's dad was and his connection to this whole UFO stuff. And then we did learn that, he said, because I've quoted it verbatim. I think the budget was 30 million, something like that. And we learned that under Carter's presidency, that exact amount of money was approved by the government towards the production company. This is what Walter Bosley has said. So it looks like the historical records back up what Keith told me about Close Encounters of the Third Kind being financed by the US government. Was Spielberg encouraged to make Close Encounters of the Third Kind for whatever reason? It could have been a perception management thing all along. And then I remember, so the first thing is I have managed to confirm that about Keith Shartle. He did work for DreamQuest. He was one of a number of people who worked, because I found it again in Starlog. He worked on Nightmare on Elm Street 4 with DreamQuest and did the optical effects on that. But I remember probably from about the early 1980s, something very similar. And it almost certainly would have been from a science fiction magazine because that was pretty much all that I read back then, sort of early 80s when I was very young. I do remember reading something about Carter's presidency and money being funded into closer to. But again, I can't remember what the magazine was. I can't remember the date. There's very specific things to it. So that kind of chimed with me. There's this lady called Verna Fields. She was a long-time collaborator with Steven Spielberg. She edited Jaws for him,
Ah, yeah.
and she edited the scene in Close Encounters of the Third Kind in the air traffic control. When the pilots are reporting that they can see the objects buzzing around them, and then they say to them, "Do you want to report it?" And they go, "Ah, we don't want to report. We don't want to report," that kind of thing. She also worked for the US Information Agency. That's the same entity that tried to recruit Kubrick for that White House Festival of Arts.
Oh,
But obviously, we don't know whether Kubrick was involved with that or not. And so I looked at her obituary, and reading it is fascinating. So this was she worked for the documentary unit of the U.S. Information Agency during the late 60s. Her time was divided between working and teaching advanced editing at USC. She tutored George Lucas. Um, she was a co-editor on American Graffiti with George Lucas, and then she went on to become this. She was Universal. She was the vice president a feature film production. So she monitored all post production on the films that were made for MCA at the time. So she edited that, but she was doing that job already. Then when she picked up this little editing thing, she edited that one scene in the film for Spielberg, and that's the scene where you've got the denial. Like, we don't want to report, we don't want to report because they're frightened.
Interesting.
So I thought it was fascinating that that was the one scene that she edited,
Yeah, very very
nothing
interesting.
else.
That is.
Yeah,
Yeah.
with her connections, she'd
Mm.
been involved with American. Um, so she basically worked with the American government on psyops propaganda for the media before she got this position as vice president MCA.
Maybe
So
she was the CIA asset then.
maybe I don't know, but I mean, it's just another one of those things that's connected to things that Douglas Trumbull was involved with. Before we get to that the moon stuff as well, should we talk a little bit about that bizarre project he was involved with, Ufotog? He was touted this idea, and at the time he was saying it was going to be a credible endeavor, advanced researched in the field, untoward seen, all this kind of thing. And he was going to get this van and outfit it with various sensors, equipments, high quality cameras, because that's one of the other things that I find interesting that potentially connects the type of alleged cameras and alleged footage and alleged lenses that were used by NASA, and the type of footage that cameras, lenses, and film that Trumbull worked with, and what he developed. And it's uncanny, actually, in terms of the overlap there. And one of the interesting things as well was that he shot things at these really high frames per second, which a number of researchers have said, if you change the speed
That's
of
right.
the Apollo footage to match those frames per second, you'll see it in
Real
normal
time.
walking
Yeah.
real time. Yeah, which is exactly the kind of frames per second that Trumbull was using with his films as well. So I thought that was interesting. But so he was going to quit this van out with these like 4K, 8K cameras, sensors, all this kind of thing, and he was going to drive this chap was going to drive this van around America, and he was going to shoot real footage, real photographs, video footage, and whatever of UFOs. And then it turned out that he was patenting this thing called the Magi pods, which I thought was interesting. Magi, the occult type stuff there, the
Yeah.
naming of
Yeah.
that anyway. So this is like a mini IMAX theatre, completely immersive. And it turned out that the showcase of those Magi pods was this Ufotog film that he'd filmed. And it
Yeah.
wasn't real UFO footage. It wasn't real, it
Yeah.
was an actor playing this character in this van, and all the UFOs that you see in it are all CGI, and they're not actually particularly good CGI either. I've seen far better things in bigger Hollywood
Yeah.
films, but he touted that. So this is what he said about it. I think there's an interview with. It was for Open Minds TV actually, which I thought was quite interesting. He
All
was
right.
interviewed
Yeah.
for that. Douglas Trumbull, special effects legend and UFO hunter, it's called. So they're already putting that slant on it, that
Mm.
bias. So he said it's a legitimate project, but I'm also making a fictional movie. I would just put myself in the range of being a human being that believes life in the universe is inevitable. Blah 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 blah. That's just him talking about UFOs. I mean, he was a big proponent of ufology and all that kind of thing. It seemed that way anyway.
Yeah.
But then he said, so the whole idea of alien existence is becoming much more credible just in the last few years, whereas it's not being credible and considered science fiction, which is fine for me because I decide it's fiction. Oh, what's that about?
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
chopping all over the place. That is. The UFO photography was an idea I started developing for my project, which was to get telescopes and radar tracking systems, try to photograph UFOs, and say to myself, well, I want to try to do this because I think I may know how to do it in a way that others don't. He said, I brought in some of my pals to try to affect this vision of photographing UFOs, and it led to the idea of possibly constructing a seemingly fictional story that could be dramatized with an actor or actress, and there's a whole story behind that. I thought I'd make a dramatic science fiction movie about UFOs and use that as a cover for the effort to actually photograph UFOs, and design the story so that if we actually got real photography, we could then put it into the movie, and suddenly the movie would become non-fiction. But he'd already made it as a fictional film. So if he had have got real footage and put it in, he'd already have been muddling it by the fact that he'd
Mm.
made a non-fiction. So
Yeah. Yeah,
what
it's a
was he
bit.
playing
Yeah,
at? You know, what was he
yeah.
playing at? He flip-flopped on that so much. It was a fictional thing. It was to promote the Magi pods. Then it was real. Oh, and then the next thing was I started it as a real thing, but people didn't like the fact that I think yeah, talking about actually capturing UFOs is not fine, he says. It's actually antagonistically greeted in the reality television community. I don't what that means again, I don't know. I couldn't get in any traction at all, and I've got a really good resume, and I talked to people who wanted to do it but couldn't do it. Couldn't find funding for it, couldn't find commercials for it, couldn't get it, considering seriously by television networks or anything. So he argued then that it became a fictional thing. But I've got contradictions to that in other interviews where he said we started it out as a fictional thing, then we were going to, if we got real stuff, we. So, any thoughts on that one? Because it's kind of
Yeah, it sounds like you say, just that he's hedging his bets, and
hmm,
it's a very peculiar sort of way of doing things. But
yeah, yeah.
again, maybe he was genuinely interested in it, but
I
he was
think he
warned off.
was. I
He was warned off, and
possibly, yeah,
he was, if it's true that he did have government connections, which it seems like he did,
yeah,
then we've heard before about when people start poking around. They're warned off. And
yeah, yeah, yeah,
don't go messing with this. It may have been that he was, I don't know, he was somehow he was worried that would happen, or it already happened when
yeah,
he
yeah,
was making those sorts of statements.
yeah, yeah,
You know, but it is very interesting that he would collect all of that equipment, like you say,
yeah,
and
yeah, yeah,
be
yeah,
putting it to that sort of purpose.
yeah. I mean, when you watch
Allegedly.
the Ufotog film, it looks like props. It doesn't
Right,
look like real stuff. It looks like
right.
on a set, a van on a set with an actor in it, and it's all green screened or whatever. It doesn't look the way he described it was going to look. If that
And
makes
so
sense.
he did actually finish, and that film was
Oh
released,
yeah,
was it?
yeah, yeah, yeah. You can
Yeah.
find it on YouTube and watch it. Yeah,
All
it's
right, I'll have to
yeah, yeah.
watch that then. I've not
It's
seen
quite
that.
a short film. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
yeah, yeah. But he's got he had government connections. He had U.S. Navy connections, U.S. Air Force connections, JPL connections, NASA connections. At various points in his career, he worked for all of them. So it is. And let's not forget as well that very early on in his career, he worked on 2001: A Space Odyssey, and he was working alongside these like Harry Langer, Frederick Ira Ordway, the two principal NASA advisors on 2001: Space Odyssey. He
right.
was working in collaboration with them, and these were like people who'd worked with Werner von Braun, Marshall Space Flight Center, all that kind of thing. So even if you don't accept the idea that NASA was officially working on the film, they were still sort of there. They worked for them. They
Yeah,
were still working. They were working on the film. You
yeah.
know. So you've
And I
got
think it's fair
that.
to say, really, we're more or less repeating what we said earlier, but maybe in a different way. You know, if we know that they faked it, and I do know this now, there's no
Mhm.
conjecture involved in that statement anymore for me.
No,
Trumbull must have known, even if he wasn't involved, he must have known.
yeah,
He
yeah,
must have known
yeah,
that somebody had done it, and he may have, like I said, known the people that did it if it
yeah,
wasn't him.
yeah,
Because somebody filmed it, somebody faked it.
yeah,
You know,
yeah, yeah. Somebody
whoever
did
it
it.
was.
Yeah,
And so and there can't have been that many names in the business, so it was either somebody with a lot of expertise who was unknown in the Hollywood and movie world, or
mm.
it was somebody who was quite well known in the movie world, and you know
I,
maybe he
I've
was.
yeah. I mean, I've never ruled out either or both.
No,
Or
no,
it
no.
may be that neither were, but I've never ever ruled out. It's always
Mm,
been
mm,
that thing that for me, the fact that it was faked, I'm convinced.
mm,
In
mm.
some capacity, there was definitely fakery without a shadow of a doubt. Um, it's the specifics of it, because it's how and what was faked and in what way and all that kind of thing. And these are the kind of quibbly things sometimes with me. But then beyond that is then the question that I always wonder about is the who.
Mm.
Is the
Oh
who.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
but that is that what we were saying before about that one other thing that we should go to is this idea of Douglas Trumbull being so good at faking space type stuff. He did these things again, it was for the Magi Pods. He was a joint venture that he was working with Virgin Galactic to create a giant sphere in which a series of smaller venues would be located called Space Island. It was located at Kennedy Space Center and we capped with a full dome theater, several full Magi theaters along with a number of Magi pods and some smaller simulators. Planned elements include the ability to drive a Mars rover, walk on the surface of Mars using augmented reality, and travel through interstellar space, experience a simulation of Virgin Galactic suborbital flight service, take mini adventures on the moon or asteroids. So he was well versed in it. He really was. Again, his early work, right back at the beginning of his career, was painting these vistas of space, planetary services, spacecraft, all that kind of thing for the US Air Force and NASA and that. You've got then what he actually worked on 2001, the effects he did. So obviously people know about the fact that he worked on the Stargate sequence at the end.
Yep.
People know that he did the insets for the computer displays, the graphic
Yep.
displays in the ships and things like that. Yeah, so this is a fantastic book which I've got fairly recently
Yeah.
actually. It's called where's the camera? Space Odyssey. Stanley Kubrick, Arthur C. Clarke, and the Making of a Masterpiece by Michael Benson, and it goes into such meticulous detail.
Looks like
Every
it.
every stage of you can tell when all the pages are
Yeah.
turned over on the corners
Oh,
where I've
okay.
written it. Literally, the dates, the days, the times when they shot this, when they shot that. It's all meticulously documented. So the entire production. So we know exactly when who worked on what and what days, what years, even the time of the day in some cases. And one of the things that he worked on was these. It was the footage that would be used when you would see like the what would it be called? Like the little moon bus, the moon shuttle thing that you see going across the moon surface. And so he had topographic imagery, maps, photographs, all that kind of thing from unmanned probes that NASA had photographed the lunar surface, and used them to recreate this model of it. So he would then have this setup with a camera that he'd sit over it or whatever in slow, frames per second or whatever. He'd film it, and then the official version in that book is that Stanley Kubrick didn't like it. He said it looked too realistic and he wanted it to look more. Um, so let me see if I can just pull up the. So, yeah, he was experimenting with creating large slices of lunar topography. That was in late 1965. And then Michael Benson said, although Kubrick would ultimately elect to use a more jagged landscape, sorry, Trumbull's softly rolling terrain proved closer to what Apollo astronauts actually saw when they started flying over the moon in 1968. Obviously, he believes the official story of that,
Yeah.
but that's neither here
Yeah.
nor there for the purpose of this. What we're
Yeah.
saying is that he really was very, very good at faking this stuff. And so then it's kind of like tying back into the this whole idea. And I've speculated on that. Let me just see if I can find some of my speculation on it actually, because this is something new actually that I don't think was in the version that I gave to you with what I'd written. So this idea of, did Douglas Trumbull fake lunar surface footage? Well, actually, if you want to, be technical, yes, he did.
Yeah.
But on
Yeah.
2001: A Space
Yeah.
Odyssey,
Yeah.
where that's concerned, anyway. And he did fake it based on this real NASA lunar topography data and all that kind of thing. And that brings me into that larger question then. He's like, did he fake it for Kubrick's movie, or did he fake it for the movie as part of a larger agenda?
Yeah.
So was it innocently done for Kubrick, or were there other parties who had a say? So imagine, if you will, somebody says to you, I've got photographic proof that Douglas Trumbull's involved with Apollo fakery. And then they present you with an image of Trumbull craned over the camera, photographing this topographic sort of model, on the soundstage in 2001. And that's actually something that I realised when I watched, which we can talk about in a minute, the Smoke and Mirrors documentary that you found
Yeah.
for me. Yeah,
Yeah.
because there are some images in that which are uncannily similar to the images I found of Douglas Trumbull filming those surfaces for
Interesting.
2001: A Space Odyssey.
Yeah.
So, yeah, so those images, it's like, what do you think at that point then? If you've got
Yeah.
one who's been passed off as, but what I think more than anything else, that I'm not thinking on it in terms of, well, it's debunked. My thinking is that is a really good, convenient little smokescreen of plausible deniability because it's something that can actually be used at a later date, and you can divert attention away from the true shenanigans that were going on with NASA at
Yeah.
that point. You can just point to, oh, that was what they filmed for 2001: A Space Odyssey.
Yep.
In that case, Trumbull and Kubrick could easily have been involved in the fakery, but they actually never were, if that makes sense.
Yep. Yep.
They did. If like, because my
So what,
argument
what
is as
so what
well.
we might be saying is that
Yeah,
a lot
I'm
of the
kind of tying
Apollo
myself up in knots here, but
well a lot of the a lot of the Apollo fakery might be outtakes from 2001.
possibly, yeah. Because one of the things that I find interesting was that Stanley Kubrick always burnt stuff. He burnt the models from 2001. He destroyed them.
Wow.
He destroyed footage if he didn't use it. If he decided he didn't want it in the film, that was it. What happened to that? Because it was shot, the original smooth surface, lunar surface that Kubrick allegedly didn't like. That was actually shot and then just disregarded, and he made a new surface too, which
Yeah.
was all more jagged and all that. So if he gives that footage then to somebody and says, "Destroy that, we're not going to use it," you've only got to have somebody. And this is for anybody who's listening who thinks I'm stretching. This is just purely hypothetical, right? You've only got to have somebody because NASA people were working on the film. Somebody who takes that footage, takes it to NASA, and then they've got something that they can use to as part of the
Yep.
fake footage.
Potentially. Yeah.
Potentially, yeah.
Yeah.
And it's a really good bit of plausible deniability then, because they wouldn't even have known that they shot it for NASA
No.
to use. Even so, they
No.
were involved, but they didn't actually know. If that makes sense,
Yeah.
I feel
Yeah.
like sometimes I'm kind of chasing my tail with this one, but it's yeah. So that's something that I've really been thinking about a lot recently.
Yeah. Well, like you say, it's a good ruse, to cover it up and make
Absolutely.
people think they're just involved with ordinary filmmaking and not necessarily part of a nefarious plot to
Mm.
fool the world, etc.
If you think about it, I'm sure I've said this to you before. Um, if you're gonna have somebody doing that kind of stuff, you want to affects people. I mean, one of the things that I found was really quite interesting when I read Michael Benson's book was that, and I have read it other places as well in other books about Stanley Kubrick, is yes, he was a genius, yes, he was a technical genius, but a lot of the things that he's credited for in 2001, other people did. He actually got an Oscar, I think, for the special effects in the film, and there was like six other people, key people that were involved in the film. They never got an Oscar for it. He got the Oscar, and they were the people that did the special effects, not him. He obviously supervised it, oversaw it,
Mm.
and I've got interviews with people where they've said, was yeah, Wally Gentleman, 1979. He said my main purpose at the outset was to act as Kubrick's general instructor in basic effects techniques. He had a commanding knowledge of still photography, but he was lacking precise knowledge of special effects operations. So, I mean, that could be because they were irked by the fact that he
Mm.
got the Oscar and they didn't. Um, I mean, who knows with Stanley Kubrick? I mean, this will amuse you, it'll amuse our viewers as well, listeners. But one of the most funny stories I ever read was about they'd constructed the Discovery model for 2001: A Space Odyssey, and he came along and he didn't like the color of it, so he said to the guy that was getting it finished, his name escapes me, um, can I want it repainting. I want it completely repainting. I'm coming back next week or a couple of weeks from now, and then I'll have a look at it then. And if I'm not happy with it, and they decided that Kubrick was just being an arsehole basically, and it didn't need painting. So they put a sheet over it, the same colour, and just left it. And then he came back like 2 weeks later, pulled the sheet off, and went, "Yeah, that's it, brilliant, great." They hadn't done anything to it. So that kind of shows how contrary Kubrick was.
Mm.
So,
Mm.
all of this is, as I always say, make of it what you will. But
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, an element of that came out in that Shining, the Clockwork Shining film, didn't
Mm.
it? Where
Yeah,
they
yeah,
were
yeah,
talking
yeah.
about how he treated Shelley Duvall,
Absolutely, yeah,
and
yeah,
that, he kind
yeah,
of goaded her into doing things she wasn't really wanting to do,
yeah,
or
yeah.
made her go places. But uh, she kind of didn't like it at the time, but then afterwards, I think she had a bit more of a philosophical
Yeah,
view about it, didn't
yeah,
she?
yeah,
You
yeah,
know
yeah,
that
yeah.
that it was just the director pushing the actors
For the best
to what
performance
for
and
the
the
best
realistic.
performance. You
Yeah,
know.
yeah. But it's a compelling idea in A Clockwork Shining. My only quibble with it, again, I do not want to sound like I'm criticizing it at all. I just wish, um, because it was fantastic how they put all that the context of the main premise that they were coming at with this idea of the film, the setting, and the film itself on the audience being like this mind control experiment, basically on in building up the context all around that. Having Mark Devlin talking about Laurel Canyon and all that kind of thing, Lookout Mountain. You've got Kathy O'Brien talking about NK Ultra, and you've got I think it was Joseph Atwell talking about Catcher in the Rye and all that kind of
That's
thing.
right.
It didn't, for me, it didn't really leave a lot of room for the specific things in The Shining itself, which I wish there'd have been more of that.
Yeah.
Because it
Yeah.
kind of felt like if you're a novice and you're not perhaps familiar with these things, then all the rest of it is fantastic for that. And maybe that's why they did it, so they could
Yep.
bring in new viewers that had never really been into that before, which is great. But I would have really liked to have seen more of the latter
Stuff in The
part.
Shining. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, to build that, open that case out much, much more, because that's something that Jay Widener did in the second Kubrick's Odyssey. He went through
Yeah.
The Shining in so much detail, and I thought this was going to do the same thing, but it actually didn't do as much.
Wasn't quite the same, was
Yeah.
it? No.
I know Ryder Lee said that they had loads of stuff and it probably would have been 4 hours long if they'd have done it. And he obviously didn't think that anybody would watch a 4 hour long. But you know me, I ramble, I'm not concise. 4 hours is great for me. I know you much prefer me, I'll just ramble. Yeah, 4 hours, yeah, bring it. I'll watch a 4 hour documentary, But then not everybody does so. But again, it's not a criticism of it. It's the information there is fantastic. You've got some great researchers on there, really well edited as well, really well done in terms of
Yeah, it
how
was pretty good. Yeah. Yeah.
worth checking out for people. Yeah.
Mm.
I think we've covered all the big points, really, haven't we?
I
I
think
mean,
so. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. I can't think of much else. I mean, you covered the Smoke and Mirrors documentary. That's
yeah,
I meant
thank
to
you
ask
so
you
much
about
for
that.
that. But yeah, we should mention that actually because they do actually mention Douglas Trumbull by name in it, don't they?
Yeah, I wondered about that. That's what I'd heard, but I don't think because the original version of that documentary had all the garbled audio.
Yeah, yeah.
I couldn't sit through it all, but I think you found
I found a
a
clean one.
redubbed
Yeah, yeah,
version,
yeah,
didn't
yeah.
you?
But there is, I've picked out just a few sentences here just to give
Go on,
people a
yeah,
general idea of what they say. So the narrator says they have a camera running over a model of a moon surface, which is what Trumbull did with 2001, which they actually accurately modelled. They had a complete setup, giant circular moon models, and they got more detail for closer landing. This is all set up for simulated landing. They had giant simulators that utilised real-time cameras run over these models. This is actually the topographic model of the moon, which is highly detailed. This is the man I believe is actually responsible for the visual effects, Douglas Trumbull. It certainly jives with what we know that he did on 2001: A Space Odyssey, but is it
yeah,
also what was done for real in
yeah.
terms of
I mean, you could say that whoever made that video was just he
Do you
discovered the
happen to
same.
know who?
No, I don't know who made it.
No.
They actually discovered the same information you did about Trumbull making that footage for 2001, and
Mm.
that's why they ended up naming him. It could be a muddle up again.
I think
Um,
I think there's a possibility
but
of that. Yeah, yeah.
you know, we don't know. But no, that documentary came to light through Marcus Allen. I heard a bit
Right.
about it
Okay.
because he was doing a talk and he mentioned it, and then I think he either posted a link to it or he said, "Oh, go and search for this," and that's when I became aware of it. But we don't know who made that documentary,
No.
do we? We still
No.
don't know. But he's
No.
clearly somebody with a lot of knowledge, and the way that documentary itself is edited is pretty amazing,
Hmm.
really,
Hmm.
with all those little video thumbnails flying about the place, as I recall.
Yeah, and
I
they've
mean, that is
they've,
something
they've
else,
changed the
actually.
speed as well. So you can again in that one they've changed the speed so you can see
Very,
what it would
yeah,
look in real
yeah.
time. And
It's
yeah,
almost like somebody like Douglas Trumbull made
yeah,
that Smoke and Mirrors documentary, isn't it? Almost.
possibility.
So,
Yeah,
you know,
yeah, yeah.
so it does really does make you wonder.
So as I said at the beginning of this, I mean, thank you so much for giving me, obviously a platform to a larger audience to get this out to, because I'm not sitting here saying Douglas Trumbull faked the moon landings. I
No,
don't, I don't know.
No.
I think there's a very real possibility that he was involved in it. But then again, as we've said, there could be a lot of muddling going on here. If you've got
Mm.
somebody takes that footage away to NASA, they wouldn't know that they were involved in it. And then
Yeah.
the other
Yeah.
factor is the people that they had as connections. Somebody could have given them first-hand accounts. It doesn't necessarily mean to say they were involved in it. So I do very much want to sort of leave that there for people to realise,
Mm. Mm.
you know, to understand where I'm coming from. But hopefully it will open it up for other people who have probably got more time on their hands and more learned than I am to take it and run with it and maybe hopefully maybe further down the line somebody will come back and say, right, I found this, and it kind of everything fits into place then. Who
Yeah.
knows?
Yeah.
It'd be
Who
great if
knows?
it
Who
does.
knows? Yeah.
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 Because it is one of those things that you know, you've obviously got on one level the fact that it was faked, which in and of itself is a huge deal. You know,
Yes.
it's one of the biggest things in human history, you know. Um, but there's also a factor of knowing who did it,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah.
I mean, some people might say, well, that's not as important as the fact that it happened. The fact that it happened was enough. We don't need to know who. But I do think it's important to get
Yeah.
some
It
of,
is. Yeah. It is. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. All right then.
All right then. Thank you so much, Andrew. I really
Thank
do
you, Carl. Yeah.
appreciate it.
Thanks for
Yeah,
doing
and
this as well. And
if you're watching this on Check the Evidence, please come over and check out Electric Media Madness. If you're watching this Electric Media Madness, please go over and check Andrew's stuff, checktheevidence.com. It's really worth taking the time to look at all of his stuff and his website as well, because it's a treasure trove. I always say that it's a treasure trove of alternative knowledge research. It's definitely worth taking the time to look at. You won't be disappointed. So, all right
okay
then, my
then.
friend, you take care
And
and
you, Carl. Yeah.
catch up
Take care
again
then.
soon. All the
Yep.
best.
Bye for now then.